the live stream. We'll see how that works out tonight. All right, it says we're live. There's a lot of multitasking involved in running a Zoom meeting if you haven't done it. So I will make this quick. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague and a board member of the Jewish Council, Dr. Kenneth Wald, who is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science. Do I have that correct?
Yes.
Okay, from the University of Florida, whose work has focused on religion and politics, which I think are very apropos for this evening's film. And hopefully everyone had a chance to pre-screen it because it was really interesting. And I think we're going to have a great discussion tonight. So I'm just going to hand it right over to Ken. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Well, it's nice to see an audience I know 90% of at least. It's kind of like I had two Zoom meetings earlier today, and it was about the same level of familiarity. So it's always good to see people again. So I thought what I would do is talk for about 10 minutes about the things in the film that really caught my eye. And then we can start questions, conversations, however. And I should be honest and say, starting out, that when I saw the word docudrama in the description of the film, I was pretty sure that I was going to hate it. I feel toward docudramas the way I feel toward fusion cuisine, which is that it's an abomination. And I have to say that I liked the film more than I thought, although I thought the biggest obstacle was simply it just went on too long and could easily have been cut in places. I think in the United States, when we think of people who have tried to or succeeded at assassinating national leaders, we probably think of people like, Arthur Bremer, who shot George Wallace, or John Hinckley, who shot Ronald Reagan, or going back, Lee Harvey Oswald, Lynette Fromm, and the like. And in a sense, it's not too much to characterize those people as losers and loners, for the most part, people really isolated. And I think it's important to understand that this attempted or this successful assassination 25 years ago was performed by somebody who is not like that. The most striking thing about the real Yigal Amir is that he was a person who was deeply rooted and immersed in social networks, several overlapping networks. And they sent messages promoting political violence, which ultimately, I think, disposed him to essentially recruit himself to engage in a violent act. And the act was enormously consequential. I don't believe in the great man theory of history, but I do truly think that Yitzhak Rabin was the one truly essential person in Israel, the one person who had respect across the usual political boundaries and could have sold Israel on the long term on Oslo. And I think he would have made a serious effort to do so, whereas Netanyahu, as soon as he got into office, just undercut it at every turn. So this mattered a great deal. I thought the film was quite accurate in the specifics about Yigal Amir. He was somebody who was immersed in what we would call modern Orthodox circles in Israel. And we use the term modern Orthodox here because the people who he lived with, while they were observant, they followed halakha, but in other respects, they were not isolated from society like the ultra-Orthodox. They were very engaged with it. They looked like other Israelis. The men, as you saw, were in the army, which is typical of Israelis. They didn't avoid state institutions. They got deeply involved in them. The Israelis refer to people in that camp, in that religious group, as the national religious. That's a more common term when you're talking about it in Israel. And by that, they meant they're national and they're committed to the Israeli state. They believe it's important, unlike, again, the ultra Orthodox, who generally deny the legitimacy of Israel as a state because it's not a Jewish state in their eyes. It doesn't follow halakha. But the national religious do, and he was very much engaged in this network his whole life. He undoubtedly came up through B'nai Akiva, which is the major youth group associated with this movement. And as you saw, he was at Bar Ilan University, which is the Orthodox university in Israel, and really is kind of the place where the national religious go. There are secular students there, there are some ultra Orthodox, but it really is kind of the university of the national religious. And it tends to be fairly right wing. It wouldn't be uncharacteristic. He served in the army, as you saw, and I think, although I don't know, he was in a special unit called a Hesder unit, which is composed of other religiously observant soldiers. The idea is if they're in their own units, you don't have some of the tensions that arise between secular and religious soldiers. And the Israeli army has worked very hard to kind of integrate the Orthodox into military service. And again, as you know, the ultra Orthodox do not participate in military service, but the modern Orthodox not only participate, they've really, in a sense, become the dominant force within the Israeli military. They are today what the kibbutzniks used to be 40 years ago. You know, where all the leaders of Israel came out of the kibbutz movement, they were all in the army. That was the place where you developed friendships and networks that became important. And in a sense, the modern Orthodox have taken over that role. We've had several chiefs of staff who are modern Orthodox, which was something that hadn't happened for the first 50 or so years of Israeli history. He was also, as you could tell, Sephardi. I don't know how much of that angle was actually true in terms of accounting for his position, but the Sephardim tend to be the most anti-Arab and, speaking broadly here, the most pro Likud group within the Israeli electorate, and that would Israeli population, and that would kind of add to the sense of alienation from modern secular Israel and make him a bit of an outsider. The one thing that was kind of striking was at the very end when he was lurking around the place where he actually shot Rabin, and he made friends with this other guy, and you heard one of the security people say to a guy who Amir had been talking to, who's that dark-skinned guy over there. And that's, again, that's kind of a code word for who's this Sephardim. I don't know that that rings true because I just don't know enough about his personal life. He did reflect strains of positions that had at the time, and I think still are normative within the national religious world. By no means everybody in that world is politically violent, but there are some, particularly the politicized wing is very intense. And among the things that they tend to share is they have introduced a kind of a new kind of Judaism in that they have sacralized the land in a way that was not part of the Jewish tradition before. Um, Many in the modern Orthodox community were concerned about the embrace of the West Bank and particularly in Gaza, calling it a kind of a heresy because it made the land more important than anything else. And of course, traditionally in Judaism, time is what is sacred on Shabbat, not the land itself. And there has historically been a great deal of flexibility among the Orthodox about the land, and not all the groups, not all the members of these groups have made it the centerpiece of their existence. So it's a kind of a religious reformulation that he clearly was in. And you also heard, and again, this has been very much the case, there's both a very strong current of hostility to democracy. Some have called it the Haredization of the modern Orthodox. They've become more like the modern Orthodox in the sense that they don't find democracy valuable because, in their view, it allows the secular and the irreligious to exercise too much power. And they've bought into a degree into what the ultra-Orthodox used to say about the state, but they want to govern the state and they want it to follow those what they see as Jewish rules. So they're anti-secular, they're anti-democratic, and that was, I think, very an accurate reflection of what happened. So after the assassination, Amir became, in some modern Orthodox circles, a hero. Several monuments were built. These were spontaneous, not spontaneous, but these were done kind of surreptitiously, and the police would always get rid of them. And afterwards, but he became kind of a cult figure, particularly to young members of the modern Orthodox community. And as they pointed out, to this day, he has not in any way shown any remorse or disavowed these positions. There was, after the assassination, a great deal of call, or many calls, for a reassessment within that world of its positions. And the government, which controls some positions that matter, did appoint people who were thought to be more moderate in their positions to positions of authority. But the sense is, for the most part, it didn't really, in the long run, it hasn't changed that dramatically. Now, because most of the leaders of Israel since Rabin's assassination have been Likud, particularly Netanyahu, and they fought tooth and nail against anything in terms of giving up the land, there hasn't been the alienation that you saw, and there hasn't consequently been that level of incitement, which is very accurately portrayed in the film. A lot of the placards and stuff reflect things that I remember seeing in Israel a couple of years earlier. But they did in general a good job, and I think they really, what struck me is what they characterized as the making of a zealot. I think we know that in Jewish history, zealotry has usually ended badly for the Jews. But it was striking how, this person who, apparently at one point was more open-minded and kind and did seem to have some good human qualities, just became so totally tied up into this zealot mindset and managed to construct a religious justification for what had happened. And again, there were divergent voices he in his environment, but he tuned them out. His father and anybody else who suggested something to the contrary, and he really cherry picked or proof texted the tradition to support his position. So that's kind of what hit me. And at this point, why don't we see if there are any questions or comments and just kind of take it from there. It'd be better if you raised your hand to ask a question. So, yeah, hi Heath, go ahead.
Hi, Ken and everybody. I have a question about Margalit and her rabbi uncle. After Yigdal spoke on the hill and he went over to speak to them, I didn't really understand what the rabbi was inferring with his response about the person who he advised Yigdal needed to be concerned about. And then, I don't know, did I miss it? I didn't understand what Margalit's involvement was actively, but then I see that she went to prison. So I'd like to know about that.
Yeah, she apparently helped at some level to get the weapon. I don't believe she accompanied him there that night, although that was initially one of the things he was trying to get her to do. And I don't really remember, what else she was involved with. The uncle, Benny Elon, Elon, is a real rabbi, and he was the one who was commonly accused most of incitement. In terms of what he was doing, what that scene in the movie, and I didn't realize it at first because I couldn't see it well. Apparently, he was pointing to that Kahanist, Avishai, I think, and saying, "Stay away from him." And it later turned out that they were correct, that he was, working for the Secret Service in that role. But Benny Allen is a real character, and he, a lot of the things that were spoken were actually documented things that he'd said word for word. In that sense, it was like a documentary. That wasn't obviously him playing himself, but he was real. So I think it was perhaps the purpose, her purpose in the film at least, was kind of the bridge to this particular rabbi, who I think he felt of any rabbi would enthusiastically endorse what he was doing. That's my take on
He
it.
didn't really endorse him directly.
No, but he kind of
The
winked at
movie.
it. At least that was my sense. Go
Yeah,
do it,
just in the
kind of
movie.
thing. Yeah. Beverly, you had your hand up. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
I,
Were you talking about right just now, the rabbi that was the uncle of his wife? Or another rabbi? I thought the uncle and his wife walked out together. And and the rabbi that she walked with said, beware of that guy. I was totally mixed up. I thought he was saying beware of the guy who was the friend of the killer.
Well, again, I think that guy who was the friend was the guy who it had been suggested was an agent of the intelligence services.
Oh,
That's my sense. I could be wrong.
okay. That's
But I was at first. I couldn't tell. I literally couldn't tell who he was pointing to. But the fact that it was Benny Alun is more important than whatever literary device they were using.
yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I wanted to point out something, some parallel between this film and what we saw last night, and that the fulcrum of the films last night, the shows last night, at some point was the father-daughter relationship and the tension there between them. And I thought there was this beautifully parallel here of the father-son relationship, and it was really very striking.
Yeah. Yeah. I confess that I don't know if that's historically accurate or not. I frankly didn't want to learn a lot about Yigal Amir. But again, I mean, and it may just have been symbolic to suggest there were other voices that he could have listened to. But, even though it was his father, and there was that sort of tenderness that time when he came in one night and the father was asleep and
Mm-hmm.
he adjusted the blanket. But even with that kind of intimacy and love, he just didn't want to hear it. And so that there is, I think the point is there's an element of contingency here and a great deal of, that ultimately Yigal Amir had agency, and he just simply screened out any view that he found contrary to the task that he'd set for himself. Yeah, yeah. Heath?
So I have a question about the statement that the father makes to Yigdal in saying that the army really changed you. I wonder if that's a common experience for young men who serve in the army, or if it's just with the national religious. And that I saw a frightening parallel. I just want to say this. I saw a frightening parallel with the way that Netanyahu behaved in those days and what we're seeing today in our country.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's not much evidence. There's not a lot of evidence, but what I've seen suggests that surprisingly, military service doesn't really change people's attitudes in Israel. In fact, there's not a lot of evidence it does other places as well. That so many of these people have been through particular youth groups and environments that have molded them over the years that they're almost resistant to change by this point. And I suspect that was the case. Whether it made him, more prone to violence and stuff, I don't know. But remember that one point when one of his friends from his army unit was sort of bragging about how Yigal would just love to beat up Arabs and go there and stuff like that. And again, I think it wasn't that anything that happened in the army made him like that. It seems that he always had that zealotry in him. That he really hated the Arabs with a passion. Again, part of that probably comes from the Sephardi heritage because the Sephardim tend to be, as I said, the most anti-Israeli. And then the national religious, I think, tend to add to that.
But there's something else here, that we're dealing with a period of intense bloodlust. There's killings going on both sides, and everyone's getting crazy. Everyone's looking for revenge, and it's a very frightening period in Israel and Palestinian life. So, and I think that one has to look at that more than anything else. And you have religious leaders who are fomenting it too, which is, I think, one of the strengths of the film is that it doesn't give you religious leaders who saying, no, 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 love thy neighbor, blah, blah. They're saying the opposite, saying it was quite amazing. Even with this nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you think someone would be saying no.
Mhm. And to be fair, there were some who did, but most of the people they portrayed were settlement rabbis. They lived in the West Bank, and they were there because they believed that Judea and Samaria were eternal parts of Israel and all that. Yeah, and the other time that kind of vitriol grew up was the Gaza disengagement thing
Yeah.
some years later, where there were enormous fears. Again, the national religious rabbis were making similar claims about Ariel Sharon that they had made, or was that Barak? I can't remember who was in charge at the time. But they were making similar incitements, and a lot of young people did, go out there. And the real concern was in the military, that the national religious soldiers would refuse to evacuate Gaza, which was their responsibility. And what happened is there were a lot of pragmatic accommodations made by unit commanders and the like, and the word kind of went out that if you have a national religious soldier who clearly would be conflicted about, expelling, other national religious people and emptying out their settlements, you should give that person the day off or send them on leave, because they were really worried about whether or not some of these soldiers would start firing on their erstwhile companions. Now it turned out it didn't happen, but apparently there was a very sizable number of them who were allowed to leave, and it remains a recurring concern in Israel, given the significance of the modern Orthodox in the army, whether they would in fact obey legally constituted authority if there were to be future disengagement efforts. Because again, once the land becomes sacred, questions of compromise and negotiation tend to leave the table. It's one of the ironies that the ultra-Orthodox have been much more flexible on questions of land, because to them, the question is, does it hurt or help? Does it save or endanger Jewish lives? And they've actually historically been more pragmatic than most of the modern Orthodox. In that sense, I'm often asked about fundamentalists in Israel, and the people who always come to mind when you say that are what Israelis call the black hats, the Haredim. But on the land, they have, and in fact, most of this, they have not been the obstacle that the modern Orthodox have been, and they're much more malleable. Yeah.
Speaking of blacks, if I could just add something to that, one of the powers of the film is the nuance it had of the divides within Israel. The ethnic divides, the religious divides, and even when he goes to meet her family, you see the way in which they're sizing him up in terms of his class, his possibility of making a living. The grandmother sort of sizes him up to where he comes from, what his ethnic background is. It was very striking.
Yeah, I also do think it's probably out of date, because what's really been striking in Israel the last 20, 30 years has been high levels of intermarriage between Sephardi and Ashkenazi that in the past would have been scandalous. Now it's kind of taken for granted. And certainly there are the grandmothers and grandfathers don't always approve, but it seems to have become much less uncommon. So an awful lot of young Israelis now have both Sephardi and Ashkenazi heritage. It's still a very powerful factor in voting in Israel. Again, if you want to look who votes for Netanyahu, Sephardim are a very large part of that condition, or that coalition rather. But yeah, it did. I think in that sense, I think it reflected what was true, perhaps in the early '90s, but diminishing in importance. So Rick had his hand up. Let me see, and then Roy. Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, in the film, Yigal was expressed his belief that Jewish law was above secular law, and my impression is that Jewish law is used for family law. But I was wondering to what degree it actually is integrated into criminal law.
Yeah, my understanding of this is more about sort of the politics of how it happened than about where it actually applies. There is a kind of a norm in Israel that if there is nothing in the sort of the laws of the state on some issues, excuse me, it is permissible to draw on Jewish law. But I think you're right that mostly it comes in a specific subset of cases. And the High Court, you know, they've always been careful to include some observant Jews on the High Court, so the secular religious divide doesn't become, you know, too institutionalized. But what has been interesting is that from Netanyahu in particular has encouraged efforts to delegitimize the courts. This has been going on for decades. And a lot of it was simply, you know, at various times the courts have raised corruption issues against him and considered them. And he has, you know, really urged his supporters to go after the court. And there's been real concerns again about violence against judges and so forth. So in that sense, that has a rather striking parallel with what we've seen in the US. It's not surprising that Trump and Netanyahu were friends, given that they shared certain political norms or violations of those norms in that category. But yeah, there are again the modern Orthodox are not as a class or as a group insistent on that all law must be religious law, that halakha is there. Early on, there were some who argued we didn't need an Israeli state or we didn't need a constitution because we have Torah. What else could we need? But the modern Orthodox used to be, again, much more accommodating on a range of issues. They used to be only concerned with getting sufficient resources to, in their eyes, ensure the continuity of their community. They wanted money for religious schools and other, you know, religious councils and the like. And they were comfortably in coalition with the Labor Party for decades. And it was really only after the Six-Day War when this sort of messianic sense swept through the modern Orthodox world that they moved over to the right. And one of the ironies is that a lot of the old parties that represented the modern Orthodox, who typically would have maybe 10 seats in a 160 body Knesset, lost a lot of their seats because essentially they were saying the same thing as Likud. And the feeling is if you want Likud's policies, you might want to vote for Likud rather than for some of their parties. The ultra-Orthodox, on the other hand, have maintained their distance, and their parties do better, even though their share of the population is probably about the same as the modern Orthodox.
Can I ask
Good.
a question?
Yeah, Mo, and then Roy. Okay, go ahead.
I did some research that the film was extremely popular in Israel, but I wasn't able to find anything that broke down reactions in the right-wing press versus the left-wing press. Do you have any sense of that, Ken?
Not really. I looked for a bit as well, but I couldn't find anything. You know, you can make speculation about this, and I'm sure there were people in the you know national religious camp who felt that it caricatured them, and I'm sure there were people in the secular world who felt that it really was insulting to them in certain ways. So I would imagine it probably fit into the existing cleavages that were there, but I don't have any evidence
The
about
other
that.
thing that I found is that they've just formed a new party around him for the election.
No, I hadn't heard, but you know,
Yeah, his wife, he got married in jail
okay.
and actually had a kid, which I assume was by artificial insemination.
Well,
And
no, there are conjugal privileges in Israeli jails.
okay, so she is heading a party now in the next election.
If only Nava had said yes, we would have avoided all of this, right?
So that's another thing I'd really love us to discuss is the politics of the two women and the romances in relationship to the narrative.
Okay. Well, Roy has been patiently waiting, so let me take his question, then we can just open up to general conversation. Yeah,
Thanks.
go ahead.
Maureen, I've read a few reviews coming from the Zionist right, and most of them were disappointed by the sort of cardboard representation or stereotypical representation of their camp. So I think that was sort of the biggest grief that they showed, and the idea that nobody, I think that came up. Nobody really said, there was no opposing views. No one rabbi that would say, this is actually a pretty bad idea, or no voices whatsoever from Yigal Amil's friends or the people he associated with that told him, this you should not do that. I think there were also some grievances about the fact that the movie didn't discuss the pain that many from that camp had felt after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. Instead, kind of showing it as so something that they accepted quite happily, or as something that should have been done, where a lot of the Zionist right really suffered as much and grieved as much as the liberal left in Israel. So this was one of the more major criticism I've read from from the right side of the map.
Yeah, it probably didn't show as much diversity of opinion as there is in that world, but I do think, frankly, it showed what I'd call the central tendency. I think it was an accurate reflection of how, the core of that community felt about Oslo in particular and toward politics in general. And again, there's a wealth of opinion data that suggests that, in fact, that remains a problem within that community. But I can imagine if you're a dissenting, member on those issues, you would have felt that you were painted with a very broad brush. I can see that. Yeah. Mo, do you want to talk about the two women and what they represented?
Alice wants to say something.
Okay. Go for it, Alice.
Well, it just struck me. I made a joke at the beginning when I got on that it reminded me that I had taught Principe today. And actually I think that's a good parallel, that Principe was not a lone wolf, but working with a group of people around an ideology that was hoping to take over the state. And with the right political change in Principe's case, World War I, they got their state. And I think there was, in this case, I think all of those, the reason why all the characters show no, why the rabbis don't dissent and so forth is because I think the movie was trying to give us a sense of a community of dissent. He shot Rabin, but he's not the only person, it's a group. And it's moving towards a political change that they want. And I don't know how.
But Alice, I would add that, but we're overlooking here the politics of the filmmaker. And
that's what I'm trying to get at. That's what I think it's expressing. And what is the politics of the filmmaker?
Well, it's obviously he's got a grudge against the national religious. And it's interesting that he made no attempt to find any rabbis who would have said no. Now, maybe there were none, but I assume that there probably were. And it becomes, I think, a takedown of the national religious. I think it's intentional, perhaps deservedly so, but still, it's like it makes you wonder.
And it draws a direct line to Netanyahu.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the important point, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Rachel.
You might have said this before. I think you referenced it, but I wasn't sure how seriously we were supposed to take the idea that his rejection by this Ashkenazi family, you talked about the way he felt like he'd really been looked over by every member of her family, and it was pretty clear they looked down on him. And it really, as you were saying, I sort of am skeptical of whether that caste system is really still, I feel like that used to be more the case in Israel. I'm wondering Roy probably has something to tell us about that. But how seriously should we take this idea that maybe that rejection in general by the Ashkenazi ruling class could radicalize somebody like him? I mean, I sort of get that, but I don't know. Is that really sort of the message here?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question. I think for me that was I was disappointed by how the film dealt with those issues. These are still issues that are on the table. I mean, ethnicity, Mizrahi Jews in Israel have suffered from being on the margins, and then if you have the Mizrahi Orthodox who are also marginalized within a marginalized group already. But then in the film, we get those little baits that the director is throwing around, but I think your response, your perplexity is there because the director doesn't really know what he wants to do with those facts. We never get an answer about whether Yigal Amil being a Mizrahi Jew or being on the margins of ethnicity and of religion in Israel is actually motivated by that to go and murder the prime minister. I think this is something that kind of just kind of thrown out to us, but never. The film is kind of afraid to make an actual statement or make an intervention, say something brave. And Ken, you started the discussion, with your disappointment from the term docudrama. But I think this is exactly where the movie's fault, that it kind of plays it safe, right? It doesn't go deeply into Yigal Amil's character, deep enough to give us some new revelation, something that we couldn't have gathered, from Wikipedia entry on the murder.
I kind of had the sense that the director was checking boxes that, if he doesn't at least reference Sephardi Ashkenazi tension, he'd get criticized for not portraying it accurately. And so he threw this bit in there that I found unpersuasive. And again, I don't know to what extent it's true. I just, I don't know enough about Amir as an individual.
Oh, it's true. Nava is a true person.
Yeah.
I mean, we did have that relationship. Yeah, this follows his biography pretty closely. So, but then again, we never know if this actually turned into a motive in in his final decision.
Yeah.
But it's not presented as a motive.
Yeah, Jack, I'd like to let Lynn and Heath speak. Okay, Lynn, go ahead.
Thank you. Good discussion. When I was viewing it, the question came up in my mind. It's all from the perspective of him. He is the one you see everything through his lenses. Mm-hmm. And then the question that of course can be part of the fiction. We don't really know what's in his head all the time. But the question is what makes a zealot? And yes, there is a rejection of the Ashkenazi, the first woman. And there's also the fact that he's dark-skinned and he's Sephardic, and I get all that. But there's also the rabbis every inch of the way seem not to say, you're incorrect in your perception of this. So in a way, they're abetting him. And getting back to Heath, I do see parallels with today, and that's unfortunate. But anyway, that's my take.
Thank you. It's a good point. Heath?
Well, I could be wrong in my perceptions, of course, but I feel like he was already on the road to his destiny before he got serious with Nava and asked her to marry him. I felt like she was just an appurtenance that was around, like he's supposed to get married and she's a beautiful young girl and he's a young man with desires and intentions and he wants someone to be his accompanier. And she wasn't going to be it, but he was already gone. He was far to the right by that time already, I think. And then with Margalit, I didn't really get the impression that he had any kind of romantic interlude with her. I don't recall him saying anything that addressed that, but that he only wanted to enlist her help. She was interested in what he was thinking and what he wanted to do. And she certainly looked Ashkenazi. She also. The other thing that I think I could be wrong about, but this idea of it's from the director's perspective, and he's certainly anti Netanyahu. I don't know. I'm not as well educated as many of the people in this Zoom are about the history and what has happened. But when I think about what I saw tonight in these 2 hours, I think you could interpret that any way you want, whether that's the question of the film. Was he justified? Do you approve of him and his actions, or do you oppose them?
I think Jack wants to respond.
Well, for one thing, I do think that the film is a takedown of Netanyahu. I mean, that's its core. I think that's indisputable. And certainly as it moves towards the end, and even what it says at the end, that Netanyahu never even mentions her being, it's like he's portrayed as a pretty nasty character. And I think it was pretty widely felt opinion among intellectuals and the cultural elite within Israel. So it's not a bit of a guess. I want to get back to the romance issue because I did feel that as the relationship between Margalit was being developed, it was getting very sexy. They were becoming very intimate with one another, and I was sort of waiting for a kiss, like I was waiting for some kind of action, and it sort of had that quality to it. Of course, they weren't going to do that, but I certainly when they're driving in the car and they're asking each other questions and they're looking over the landscape and he's showing her how the gun and it's pretty intimate. I mean, it's much more so than with Nava. I thought that was interesting, but I don't think that is crucial in terms of making the his actions. I think it's crucial in terms of giving us some sense of who he is and his possibility for a life, of the other alternative possibility for life. But I'm not sure how it motivates him, and I think the film shied away from using that as a motivation. He's trying to impress her. I don't think it ever says that.
It's one of the reasons, though, I don't like docudramas. I mean, pick one or the other because to me it just seems silly. I mean, that scene in the library when Margalit comes in, and I mean, she's trying to seduce him again within the framework of the religious worldview. And I was thinking, oh, this is stupid. And I understand again that she was, she would have been the kind of woman who was willing to do anything to support a man who would give his life. But Nava sort of looked at him like he was in this weird death cult, and I think that that was pretty. I think it was pretty striking. He just didn't get it at some fundamental level. And like when they had him go to her wedding, I mean, it was just. I kept looking at my watch, saying that's the half hour that should have been cut out of this film. But I'm a barbarian when it comes to these things, and I'd rather have seen, as I said, a documentary. So what can I do? What can I do? Yeah, Roy, go ahead.
So I think, yeah, Jack, I think I agree. I think the ethnicity aspect definitely didn't provide a motive, and again, I keep searching this film for this motive. So what in this film makes us crack this character? I still don't have that answer. Why is that it is why is it Yigal Amir that went ahead and shot Yitzhak Rabin when he was engulfed in so much hatred? So many people around him had the same notions, so many rabbis that affected so many other students. Why was it Yigal Amir? And I think the movie kind of doesn't really give us that character analysis.
I think he says that he's laser focused. He's a laser pointer, and whenever he sets a goal for himself, he gets there.
Right, that's a really good point.
Trait.
It's a really good point. It's like other people of his background or his politics may have had the same idea, but he was a laser pointer, and he would go and do it. I think it's really very insightful.
Mm-hmm.
It is
Gail,
super skilled.
Gail wanted to let Gail speak, please. Yeah.
Sure. So I agree that that's not the motivation, but I think that the love interests in part, they're showing sectors. And one of the things we're all glossing over is his status, not only as Sephardim or Mizrahi, but Yemenite. And the mother actually says that explicitly. When she brings her little Yemenite home, do you think they're going to react to you? So they sort of give us that dynamic of being completely marginalized. But I really think the film insists that it's a religious belief that is conveyed to him by the rabbis. If anything, if the film sends me any message, it's that. It also sends the message that, of course, one of his enemies are the secular immigrants who've come. And those are distinct from the population that you see in Margalit. And the distinction between, classes, I'm sorry to say, or grades of Mizrahim, we're not really discussing, because although there is more integration, sure, there's more integration among certain groups more than others. And I think that the film sort of zooms in, but subtly on that, even if we haven't discussed it, because Yemenite comes out several times. And then I think even in that last scene when he's supposed to be undercover, it's marked. So the relationship with the second love interest, because Mo, you wanted to talk about the roles of the various women, which are mothers and love interests. I thought both of them have those moments where you wouldn't consider a modern Orthodox person going to be in that scene where he's just about to kiss Nava, first of all, when they separate, and he has no clue that he's completely blown it with the family. And that I don't think is dated. I think it's quite accurate, and even today and even here. But the seduction scene in the library, my question there was, was it seduction by idea? Or was it seduction because he's the bad boy? And I wasn't quite sure about it. Well, it's true. I mean, that was the question I asked.
That's great.
It's
like a Seinfeld episode.
Mo?
Yeah. One of the things that's going on in that exchange in the library, and one of the things that happens structurally throughout the film, is this verbal presentation of his intention to act violently, and his constantly telling people where he stood and that he thinks that Rabin should be killed and not the Arabs, and all of that. Completely part of the film structure, because you wouldn't tell everybody.
And for religious reasons. I mean, he justifies it for religious reasons. Not the rabbi. It's not prejudice, but it is because that's what
God. What's going on in the library is that she is actually playing this mind game with him about being an informer.
Yeah.
And testing him in a certain way, that he doesn't believe she's an informer, and that they can then become a duo. It's a inside a radical movement testing situation in a bizarre way that actually doubles as a flirtation. And what was interesting to me in the presentation is that because the film's parti pris seems to be the rabbis were behind it, is that he goes to rabbi after rabbi and basically says, I want to do this. What's the justification, or is there a justification? And that nobody turns him in.
But does she bring her uncle there because she is ideologically aligned with him, or does she bring her uncle there to the next meet? Because the first meet she says, I went to the rabbi from my settlement, and then she brings her uncle. So when her uncle is there, is it for ideological reasons, or is it the light sort of love interest reasons? That didn't come out clear to me, and I don't know if it's part of the actual story. Does anyone know?
No, but I do think, and I want to go back to what Maureen was saying too, that the reason the rabbis, the various rabbis, was that the fact that they said nothing, makes him really complicit in what happened.
There was
Even though,
the one rabbi though said, "What, you were going to cause a civil war?" No, I'm not going to say anything.
but
That's
he doesn't say no. He doesn't say you don't do this. We don't do this. And so they are complicit with the murder. And I think that's what the filmmaker was really doing.
Yeah.
I don't
I
know if this
actually,
is,
no, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead,
I don't
Alice.
know if this is just the filmmaker or if it's real, but I think that what made him unusual or made him the person who did the murder is, or succeeded at the murder, is that he's a seducer. And he's a seducer all the way through. So he seduces he's not only seductive with the women, but he's seductive with the policemen. And he's seductive with the rabbis. He can go up to anyone and talk to them and get them to support him.
Except for the Ashkenaz grandma. I'm sorry.
Okay, but
No way.
that just proves the point in a way, right?
From start to finish. So he presents himself as this extraordinary person, and his father basically tells him, no, you're not. You're just a little bit of a megalomaniac, and the Ashkenazi family, when he's talking first to the grandmother, she's, very poker face, right? But he's history, right? And then when you get to the second parents, and he's standing there, don't worry about my future. Yeah, I'm bumming out of law school and I kind of blew that and maybe I'll do computers, but I know what I'm doing. That isn't taken seriously. So
but that's the family. Out in the world, he's a law student, he's handsome, he can talk to anybody. And so it makes me wonder about how much he's manipulated the answers that he gets all the way through.
He's also black.
There's that. Yeah, I mean that's why I said he's not just Sephardim or Mizraim, if you will. He's he's Yemenite, and it does make a difference in terms of the film. I don't know whether that charm, that charisma, since most of it's told from his perspective, being shown from his perspective, isn't his perspective. There's not an enormous amount of outside collaboration of that image of him. I'm not sure. What I found weird, and I was curious if any of you have seen the other Rabin doc, not docudrama, but the documentary, The Last Day. Okay. Did you? Oh, okay. Because it's obviously very, very different to see it, the story told via the story of Rabin versus the story told this way and in docudrama. I wasn't as horrified by the docudrama as many, even though many of you know I'm like the least patient person in the world for things that need to be cut. But I thought they did a really good job on the thriller aspect, even though we all know the end. And it was hard to watch throughout the entire film. And I know a number of you felt that way or mentioned it earlier when we first came in. But it was disturbing.
It was very disturbing. I felt, I of course I'd seen it before, and I remember it as a very good film, but I didn't remember how disturbing the film was. And when we were watching it, about just a certain point in the film, maybe 40% through, I kind of said, I don't think I can really watch this. And then at some point, it became very, very, very compelling. And perhaps it was in the family relationships, his relationship with his father and his mother. At that point, I became really captivated by this. It took on a warmer tone than it had before.
I think was a really good actor.
He was a good actor. There were a number of good actors, actually, when you come right down to it. The father was terrific. He was very good. The girlfriends were interesting.
Yeah. The thing that I found persuasive in a way, and I think the film really, provided a sense of understanding about, is the way in which people go about sort of merging their religious and their political ideas. because there's this sort of model that people used to have about, well, if religion affects politics, it's through theology, and individuals look at the tradition and infer the policy implications and go act on it. And what I liked was the way it showed an individual, constructing or extracting from Judaism and constructing a religious worldview, trying to find support from the rabbis, but kind of picking and choosing among which of those rabbis that he would choose to take seriously. And then by the end, it was, again, he had no as he portrayed it, he had no alternative. There was literally nothing else he could have done, given the way he understood the tradition. And it went from being something he had constructed, and I think wasn't quite aware he was doing this, but by his selection and by his exclusion of alternative perspectives, he was really creating a perspective. And I think that's actually how it works for most people when it comes to reconciling religion and political imperatives. So in that sense, I thought it was a good illustration of the way that works. I think it was truer to life than most of the ways we think this is the case. Jack?
If I could throw something else in here, and I want to go back to this his blackness. That it isn't just sort of the relationship between Judaism and the individual. It's also sort of the primitive aspects of Judaism, and what he represents is sort of a very primitive Judaism. There's Yemeni Judaism, there's Black Judaism, in which you see what the Torah says and what the rabbi says, and that's what you follow. It's not like this sort of BS where you think, well, it's all metaphor or blah, 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 or you tone it down in various ways. This is what he believes in some very, very fundamental way of how one is supposed to behave. It's an interesting portrayal. I mean, it's because, again, I'm very struck by how black he is within the film.
But Jack, you've seen how his father really opposes his worldview,
right?
And I think the film at some point when they have the big the big debate between them, you see Galamir actually talks to his father. He calls him a diasporic Jew. So it's actually so the Judaism that his father brought with him from Yemen doesn't really adjust itself to this new Zionist Judaism that Yigal Amir developed growing up in Israel, right?
Or the religion on the ground, right? So
Yeah.
there's always that separation. I have to ask, for those of you, I think there was one or two who had seen The Baker and the Beauty, where you have the Yemenite family, and the girl, the love interest, is supposed to be Sabra, but in fact, everything about her father looks Ashkenaz, right? Have you seen it? Has anybody seen The Baker and the Beauty yet? That series? Oh, well. In any case, the opening of this, when you see that the Nava story with that as an intertext, it's just so, it seems obvious. It does seem caricatural or cardboard like, but the Yemenite family, as warm. Remember, the moment that she gets freaked out and leaves is when they say they sing together and talk to each other and play games, and she's like, "I'm out of here." So that disjunction, if you will, between cultures that it plays up, within Israel, I think is really important. But if you haven't seen The Baker and the Beauty, think of it in terms of, think of it in comparison to the Nava story, because I think it's an interesting comparison.
That's an American TV series, isn't
Oh,
it?
no, don't watch the American one, the Israeli one. Sorry,
Oh.
the American one is made on the Israeli one.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Jordan. Hi, Jordan.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to speak to, as Ken, I think, expressed it, his cherry picking of Talmud. I mean, you could see him laying out verse after verse, and he'd circle a word here and circle a word here, and he was just picking those pieces that worked for him. He was then presenting them to his rabbis, who couldn't, my thought was they couldn't quite figure out what he was trying to say or what he was trying to get at. And so they passed it off as, wonderful, keep going. So, I guess I had some problem there. And that led me to draw a parallel between the cherry picking of words and zealotry as it comes out, even almost until today.
It's quite parallel to how Muslims use the Quran to support violence.
I wasn't so sure the rabbis didn't know what he was talking about. They pretty much had all conceded that Rabin could be seen as an informer and as a sort of enemy of the Jewish people without telling him what to do. In fact, the very first rabbi that he consults, doesn't he say, you shouldn't have even consulted me. If you feel this way, you should go out and do it, basically, no? Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they are complicit.
Oh, I agree with that.
Which is why it was such a great, timely film for, I mean, Incitement, given everything that we're watching every single day right now.
Mm. Mm. Sure.
Well, we've been at it for a while, so I think we've probably reached a good stopping point. It was good to see all of you virtually. I always want to say it's great to be with you, but I'm still at my dining room table, so it doesn't
Thank
work
you. It was
better
very
than that.
good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, it was good. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Ken.
the comments. Okay, great. Everybody take care, and perhaps I'll see you at some of the other post film talks. So
Are you guys
everybody
announcing?
take care.
Bye-bye.
As a friend of mine said today, be positive, but test negative. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are you guys doing the film announcement or we all know?
Do a film announcement. Sorry. Saturday night,
Oh,
not to be missed.
not to be missed.
Not to be missed. It's my Polish honeymoon. It's a very good film. It's, thank God, a light film, a relatively light film. It's meant to be sort of a date night film. It's a good film, and we will have a discussion, and Gail will conduct that discussion. So I do recommend it, and it's a nice breather from some of the heavy films we've seen. But it's a good film nonetheless. It's an interesting film nonetheless, with a lot of interesting things within it. So.
And then a double feature Sunday, right?
And then Sunday, it's a double feature. We have The Rabbi Goes West, which I like a lot. It's a documentary. It's a very good documentary. I mean, it's a very compelling documentary. Raises a lot of interesting issues about the contemporary Jewish community and the place of Chabad within it. And then in the evening is my favorite film. It's a film I most like in this festival. My Uncle the War Hero. It's a very, very interesting, there's a very interesting sensibility in that film, in the documentary. And I think you'll appreciate it if you watch it, what I'm talking about. So.
And then there's Roy's at the end. I'll see.
I'll see. That's the last one.
Sorry, Roy.
Oh, the last one. I'll see is a very interesting film. It's a very surprising kind of film, and so it's on an African American basketball player who makes Aliyah. He plays basketball in Israel and decides to move there, and he has a very checkered career. For a variety of reasons, but it's an interesting story, and it's worthwhile. I was kind of struck by it when I saw it. It's not something I knew anything about. So then we'll have our newest faculty members speaking about it afterwards. Wait a second, we're missing something, because when is? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So on the Rabbi Goes West, so Rachel Gordon is going to be speaking on that.
Yeah. So thank you. Oh, sorry.
No, and that's it. That'll be it for this series. We are talking about the 11th annual Gainesville Jewish Film Festival and having it in March. So we seem to be committed to moving ahead with it. And so I'm kind of committed to starting to screen films.
Thank
So
goodness we have things like this through this
absolutely,
year.
absolutely.
The arts
Yeah.
community really saved us.
Mm.
Mhm.
Tell that to my grave.
Thank you, Skip, to those who remain. There's a Hungarian film as well.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, those who
Oh, I
remain.
forgot about that.
No, that's
Yes.
super important. Right.
It's more of an art film. It's a good film, and it's for those who like European art films, this is one of them. It's very interesting. So sorry, I forgot about it.
And that's introduced by Maureen. Okay, I have 60 papers to grade. Jordan, great to see you. And
All right.
everybody.
Say that again, Gail. I love to hear people say things like that.
Oh, you and Maureen kill me. So long to go. It seems.
Best thing about retirement, no
Oh.
grading of papers. Still have to review manuscripts, but no grading of papers. So.
I want to put a plug in for and Virginia, you can deliver a little more information about this, I think, but there's a Hanukkah play on December 10th that Actors Warehouse is putting on. On
Yeah.
Tuesday, I got the most beautiful, and maybe all of you did too, a beautiful email from Stephen, who's the head of the Actors Warehouse, saying, I'm okay. Please give your money to somebody else. I mean, what kind of solicitation is that? So I think it'd be great to, get a large turnout to support that for them.
Right. So so the Jewish Council has sponsored this play along with, I want to say, the Alachua County Tourism Bureau or something. They got a small grant from them for the Actors Warehouse to put on a play, which is going to be Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. And they started filming it at Temple Shir Shalom today. We saw some of the people in there. It'll start not live streaming. It'll be recorded for streaming from December 10th through the 18th during Hanukkah. It is free, thanks to me and us, the Jewish Council. And mitzvah makers.
We're all in this together.
Absolutely. No, we're really looking forward to that. It's going to be very nice. So, I mean, I will say that there has been an abundance of really interesting Zoomable content from the Jewish community. It's really amazing. I'm so grateful, because otherwise I don't know what we'd be doing if we didn't have virtual content to offer the community. So thank you for patronizing the film festival. We really do appreciate it so much. And looking forward to planning the next one.
And by the way, we are trying to get a vague idea about how many people are attending these films. So if you could, email Virginia with some information on how many people have been attending. We're not policing this. We're trying to show numbers to the various authorities who do police us.
Yeah.
So if you have 3 people in your household or 5 who are watching, it's very helpful for us to know that. So, because we don't know at this point how many people have been watching these films.
And I think the most sensible thing would be to send a follow-up survey, and people can give us that information. But yeah, it would be helpful for us to know, how many people are actually seeing the festival. And, I keep track of who logs on for the discussions. And I think so far, it seems like people have responded well to this. So we were very grateful to have the technology and the opportunity to put this in front of the community. So thank you. And have
Virginia,
a great night.
Thanks for arranging this. Virginia, what do they charge for doing this?
Well, I'm in a bit of uncharted territory. There is a fee to become a client. That's a one-time thing. And then from there you get charged something like a penny a minute for streamable time per person. So if you're watching a movie 3 times, if you get it from us, we get charged for every time you watch it, that's what we agree to. But that's how that works, is the client streaming the content is what we get charged for. I literally have no idea how much this is going to cost. I'll see at the end of the festival. And that's as transparent as I can be about this, because We have no way of calculating how many times someone may watch a film. We know what the basic price is, but at the end of the day, that'll get, calculated out when they run the numbers on the interface with our community on these. And it's actually going beyond our community. We have a pie graph that shows, Canada, different places around the United States are tuning in, which is kind of cool to see that folks are getting this in other places, however they're getting a hold of it. So, but yeah, I can't tell you what the cost will be until probably maybe the end of December.
A suggestion for the future is to actually just give it a time. In other words, that it's 7 o'clock and that's it. That's a time to.
Oh, for discussions? Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
No, for
the film.
For watching it, yeah.
That
Hard, not
one of the great things about this was that I could just watch it when I could.
Whenever you wanted to, yeah.
Also in pieces, I don't watch all of them straight through. I can't sit in a chair in my own home for 2 hours. So.
No, I lie in bed and do it.
So that might be too much information, Jack, but
No,
at
I'm
any
not doing
rate,
anything. I just watch the movie.
so I would say that I think people really like the opportunity to tune into a film for more than just the day that it screens. For me, for the person who's taking in the income, that means somebody can buy a ticket after the time that we've screened this movie, and that's more income opportunity. So I'm going to say no to that only one screening thing. 72 hours works really well for us on that. And I put the emails out that say you can still screen this movie, and people have been doing that. So there's a lot to be said about this virtual platform of the film festival. I mean, there's nothing to be said or nothing like the experience of being in those really uncomfortable seats at the Hippodrome, being together in that space. But from my perspective, the convenience of running a film festival like this, I hardly even need to leave my house to arrange this event for you guys. That's amazing.
But two things I noticed. One is that despite his endless complaints, Ken was not eating popcorn tonight.
You didn't see me watch the movie. You did not see me watch the movie. I was going to say that's the great virtue.
We could eat popcorn.
We need to have someone who remembers from now on who the designated person is to remind Virginia to take
turn off the recording.
Turn off, but also to turn off the live stream.
True, you're right.